Hello, welcome to Chapter by Chapter, an ongoing reading of, we're in the New Testament right now. We're in 1 Corinthians, and a letter from Paul to the Corinthian church. We're in chapter 7, and again, the Corinthian church had a lot of issues. And we get into a lot of stuff was about sort of marriage and sexuality and all that sort of stuff, which is quite interesting, especially given kind of the stuff that we're dealing with. So he gives here, it's an interesting chapter because he gives a lot of advice, and he's semi-clear about this is my opinion, this is what the Lord says, that sort of stuff, and back and forth. A lot of it, of course, comes from his own sort of cultural background and all of that sort of stuff. But we'll see what he has to say and talk through it. As I did yesterday, I'll just go ahead and read on through, and then I'll go through and talk about each bit. So let's listen for the word of God to speak to you. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. This I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind, and another a different kind. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone in the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But obeying the commandments of God is everything. Let each of you remain in the condition in which you were called. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever is free when called is a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters. In whatever condition you were called, brothers and sisters, there remain with God. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that, in view of the impending crisis, it is well for you to remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you do not sin, and if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. I mean, brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his fiancée, and if his passions are strong, and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. It is no sin. Let them marry. But if someone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity, but having his own desire under control, and is determined in his own mind to keep her as his fiancée, he will do well. So then, he who marries his fiancée does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do better. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. But in my judgment, she is more blessed if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Okay, before you start throwing stones at me, these are the words of Paul, and he is trying to be very clear about what is him, what is he thinks is God, but he definitely comes at it from his own perspective, right? From what we know about Paul, he was either not married, or maybe he was married, and we might think not terribly happily, but he certainly is acting as if he's not married. Not in a sexual sense, but is in that he is not necessarily bound to someone. And so this is one of the reasons why he's able to do all these things, but he definitely doesn't have a terribly favorable view of marriage, but he does make some interesting points. So let's go through this and just kind of see where we are. All right. So concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. So this is a directly looking at kind of the letter that was written to Paul from the Corinthians, and this is presumably a quote about not touching a woman. And so he says, okay, sure, that's fine. But because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. That sexuality is most properly displayed and works within this covenantal relationship of marriage. Okay, that makes perfect sense. The husband should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer and then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, so what he's talking about here, presumably, is kind of the idea of sort of withholding sex. That's not a good thing in this marriage covenant. To do that is going to set yourself up or your mate up for temptation, either through various self-motivational sort of tactics, or they might go and seek someone else. You don't want to put that sort of stumbling block before them. That seems to be what he's talking about. So maybe there was this case where there was it sounds like maybe a man who was married but was not engaging sexually with his wife at all because maybe he thought he needed to do other things, maybe from some other things that Paul was saying. And Paul's saying, that's probably not the best way. But this is all a concession. He says, this I say by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. So he realizes this is not necessarily something for everybody. He thinks that it's great for him to not be married, to not be bound by that. For him, that's totally fine. He's not overly worried about sexual needs and that sort of things. He's not concerned about that. He's, as far as we can tell, living a celibate life, and he's just fine with that. And he's like, I wish everybody else was like that. He's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But if you can't do that, don't do that, because it's going to be worse for you. We might look to the Roman Catholic Church and stuff that is going on within it, and spoilers, has always been going on within it, of you put this blanket of celibacy over everyone, whether or not they're actually really truly called to it. And some people are not going to handle that well, right? It might be better, sure. Arguably, this is what Paul says. It's better for ministry if you're unmarried, but not everybody can handle that. I know I would not be able to handle that, but anyway, so let's not get into that. All right. To the unmarried and the also, I want to say the possession sort of thing, that a husband's body is not his own, but it belongs to his wife, and the wife's body belongs to the husband, and it's sort of this mutual thing. That's part of what this marriage thing is. Now, that's not possession, and you notice it's mutual, right? It's not just, and what we might expect from a first century man is that the wife's body belongs to the man. End of sentence. But that's not what we get. We get both, right? So it's this mutual possession. This shall be one flesh, right? There's a mutual back and forth. If you want to refrain, great, do it for a good reason, but for a certain point of time. All right. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am, but if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. And again, this is kind of the concession. It depends on your sort of motivation and your drive. It may be possible to be celibate. That is, throughout the church, that has been something as an option for certain people who are called to that celibacy. And in American culture, we don't talk about that at all, because we put sex so much on a pedestal, like this is the highest possible thing possible. I'm saying possible a lot. And we can't believe that anyone might be called to that idea of celibacy. But maybe people are, right? There are people who are just asexual. They don't have much of a sexual drive. How do they fit in, right? Do we force them into this thing where, no, you have to participate in this? There may be people who, for various reasons, or for a season, are called to a celibate lifestyle. And that's something that in our culture we should actually be holding up, because it's maybe more healthy for people in those periods of life. Certain people are called to this. Maybe that's a good thing. But not everybody is called to that. So don't try to take on that lifestyle if that is not the way that you're wired. If you're going to be led to lustful thoughts and all sorts of things, to lead that celibate lifestyle, why don't you get married, and then you have this context in which those sexual desires can be met in a way that is appropriate. That's kind of the idea. Yeah, there you go. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. This idea that, especially among believers, divorce is a concession, right? God has created us to be in these covenantal relationships, I believe. But we are weak, right? So there are times when this fails. Now, it's an interesting thing. It's kind of both sides, but it's kind of not, right? The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate later, remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. Like those are the options. And then the husband should just not divorce his wife. Divorce happens, yeah, and sometimes it's a better situation. However, it's not what God ultimately wants for us. So are there ways that we can, deal with stuff and learn through them? Yes. Are there times when that's just not going to work? Yeah, unfortunately it is. But there you go. And he goes back. Yep, that one. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord. And you notice that we've switched now. Above he's stating is the Lord's opinion, right? Not I, but the Lord. This one, it's I, not the Lord, right? This is just my opinion. That if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. I think an element of this is we're talking about a time when it is potentially dangerous to be a Christian. So I think part of this, maybe not all of it, but certainly a part of it is you become a believer, your husband or your wife doesn't. There's some real danger, right, for them. Someone finds out that your husband or your wife is part of this group of Christians. It doesn't matter if you are or not, right? You're potentially in danger. So maybe that's part of it. This idea of, if that person, they just can't handle it and they separate, okay, that's their decision, right? I think that's maybe part of that, but anyways, that's not the Lord. That's just me, right? That's my opinion on it. Just kind of figuring out how that all works. But this idea that relationship may be actually redemptive, that husband, wife, and you notice there's a back and forth, right? Which is, again, surprising for a first century Jewish male, right? He's very sort of egalitarian. No, he's not up to the level of 21st century America, absolutely. But for where he is, he's actually pretty progressive in this. It's not just about woman, you're at fault, man, you shouldn't do this, that sort of thing. It's a both and. It's a back and forth. So an interesting thing there. Back to this. However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. I have no idea what that means, and I don't really want to. I'm not sure how you undo a circumcision. Yeah, I have no idea, but keep with it, right? He says, was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but obeying the commandments of God is everything. Let each of you remain in the condition you were called. Now that second one makes a lot more sense, right? Because there was great pressure within the Jewish side of the church saying, Gentiles, you need to take on the whole law. Part of that is you must be circumcised. What Paul is saying here is, no, that's not, what happens with that is not important to your salvation. How you react to the living God, that's important. So if you were circumcised before, great. If you were uncircumcised before, fine. Doesn't matter, just worship God, right? Don't make these radical changes so that you can be sort of conformed to the law. That's not what this is about. I think that's what he's talking about. He continues on with that sort of thought. Were you a slave when called? Do not be concerned about it. Even if you can gain your freedom, make use of your present condition now more than ever. For whoever was called in the Lord as a slave is a freed person belonging to the Lord, just as whoever was free when called as a slave of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters, in which condition you were called, brothers and sisters, there remain with God. Here is a fairly controversial scripture because of the slavery aspect, right? If we look at it in 21st century, we go, you're saying they should remain in slavery? Well, yes, because it's in first century Palestine. The idea of an abolition of slavery thousands of years in the future, right? What he's saying is, if you were a slave before, serve your master, sure, but you're serving the Lord ultimately. Know that you are free in certain aspects, and fulfill the duties that you have. If you're a free man, guess what? You're a slave to righteousness now, right? So if you were a slave, you're now free. If you are free, you're now a slave. Think about the vocation. Think about where you're called. And this absolutely has to do with now, right? What is your job? What was your job before you were saved, if it was a later thing? Well, just keep up in that thing, right? Serve God in that thing that you're doing, in whatever you do, whatever you're called to in your work. Serve God through it. Worship through work, right? Don't go... Everybody who becomes a Christian doesn't need to become a minister, right? That sort of idea. All right. Now, where's mine? All right. Unmarried and widows. Concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord. Yes, nothing. But I give my opinion as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. I think that, in the view of impending crisis, it is well for you to remain as you are. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, do not sin. You do not sin. And if a virgin marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life. I'm going to get to that. So part of this theology is this sort of like impending day of the Lord stuff, right? He's expecting Christ to come back any moment now. I think this is fairly early days for Paul, I think. And he's still kind of working things out. But there was this feeling in the church, and it continues now. It's much, much, much less. But it was very much this, Jesus is coming back any moment. So what do we do now, right? Do we keep going to work? Do we get married? What do we do? And so he's saying here kind of, keep going, but know that things are going to happen. Right? Maybe it's the coming day of the Lord. Maybe he's seeing this persecution that's going to start up. So how do we live our life in light of that? He's going to go on and say this, and we get into kind of his view of marriage. Yet those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. Right? There's a certain amount of distress that comes with marriage, right? If it's just you and that's all you have to worry about, there's going to be less issues than if you have to live with someone else and share your life with that other person. Now, I think there's great, great benefits. And I don't know, I certainly couldn't live without my wife. She's amazing. But there are some distresses that come along with that. And he's saying, you know what? If you could avoid that, avoid that. This is one of the reasons we think maybe Paul had not a very nice marriage. Brothers and sisters, the appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no possessions, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the present form of this world is passing away. Back to this idea of the crisis. This world is passing away. right? Now, it's not taking as short a time as Paul thinks it is, but we get so caught up with the here and the now and this present age, and we don't think about what is to come, right? Francis Chan has a big thing about, everything in light of eternity. Well, if we're spending eternity in heaven with God, and we spend 70, 80, 90 years here on this earth, well, there's a big difference between those, right? So maybe we should start living our lives with an eye on eternity. And so how does that affect our relationships? How does that affect the way that we live our life? I think this is what he's talking about, that live for something beyond this world. That may be a simplification, but it's there. Anyways, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried woman and the virgin are anxious about the affairs of the Lord, so that they may be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about the affairs of the world, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to put any strain upon you, but to promote good order and unhindered devotion to the Lord. We can spend more time in scripture reading. We can spend more time in serving one another. We can serve more time in ministry if we're not married. That's his point, right? And that's the reason behind why the Roman Catholic Church calls their priests to celibacy, and nuns and monks and these sorts of things. Because if you don't have that to worry about, then you can spend more time serving God. That's absolutely true, right? And because I think he has not a great view of what a good marriage can look like, I think that's what he tends towards. However, and not even a however, it is a point, right? There's less that you have to worry about if you're married. That's what he's saying. However, I think there's great benefit in marriage, obviously, because I'm married. But there you go. But it's also, back to the earlier, it's not necessarily for everyone. Celibacy is an option. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if the husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes, only in the Lord. But in that judgment, she is more blessed. But in my judgment, she is more blessed if she remain as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Kind of finishing that up. As far as Paul is concerned, you're better off if you're not married. If you're already married, keep up with it. If you're not married, it's almost this idea of like, if you're not married, great. Just keep loving God, keep doing ministry. If you're having a problem sexually with that, if you're unable to sort of not be tempted, get married. Absolutely. That's for you. But he's wanting to have these people ready and able to do ministry and not be divided as far as their masters between husband or wife and God. That's kind of the idea that I'm getting, but this is a pretty controversial one, and there's lots of discussion about it, and we haven't figured it all out, right? There are people who say this whole letter, frankly, but some of this section should just go away. But I will notice, as I said before, there was a little bit of inequality, egalitarianism to it, which is more than we might expect. From Paul, because he is not always the most sort of caring and gentle guy, but from a first century male in general, it's both and, right? He's looking at people as equals. Husbands don't do this, but also wives don't do this, right? It's not just wives, you're not supposed to do this, don't do it. Husbands, do whatever you want, right? Men, do whatever you want, which is kind of what we might assume. Anyways, some thoughts on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So if you have comments, if you have questions, go ahead and let me know. Like this video, share it. Dislike this video if you don't like it. Let me know how things are going. Let me know if you like this new format. Go to our website, faithpresbyteriansc.com. Join me for for more, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.